Among hegemony's enemies, there must be none more prolific on the internet than Michael Tracey, raconteur journalist. He joins us now. I'm James Poulos. This is Zero Hour. Michael Tracey is a journalist. Maybe that's not a bad word after all. And some may say controversial commentator. He doesn't just court controversy, he woos it. You can find him on Substack and X at mtracey. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me. That intro music puts me back in a frame of mind of like mid-2000s indie rock. So yes, I appreciated that.
I was there, as what's his name from LCD Sound System once sang. So
James?
Memorably. Yes, I think he's a James, right? Murphy?
James Murphy.
James Murphy.
I think it's James Murphy.
That's the one.
So we're already bonding over
yes.
indie music nostalgia.
To the
so
matter
we're off to a
good start. You're a self-proclaimed journalist. Apparently that is not, in fact, a bad word yet.
Begrudgingly.
Because
I can't think of a better word to use, so I just have been stuck with it.
But now I will stick you with this. What does journalism mean to you?
What does journalism mean to me? Well, it doesn't mean this whole like spectrum of ideological baggage that a lot of people assign to the concept of journalism. Like, it's really just a basic practice that anybody can on principle partake in. Thankfully, in our country, the First Amendment affords any citizen the right to engage in the freedom of the press. Like, it's not a designated,
depending
credentialed
on which Supreme
class.
Court justice you ask.
Well, perhaps, but it's in general not a designated, credentialed, specialized class of people who need to get some ideological litmus test satisfied to engage in. So, I mean, it's just about discovery of the world and transmittal of truthful information. That's what I try to do. I mean, just to speak for myself, what I try to do is apprehend conundrums going on in the world as accurately as I can and reflect that to readers and viewers and so forth, especially if I find something is being under-examined or there's a flaw in the prevailing examination of it. But really, it's something that I think all people should, in theory, be capable of doing if they have enough discernment and enough, perceptibility.
You think reality still sells?
I think it can, yeah. I mean, the reality of what's transpired just over the past year or two is, I think, liable to sell a lot of copies, in that there's like some inherent excitement that you can convey in it. You don't want to be crude about it and make it seem like, real world strife and conflict is just some kind of like Hollywood misadventure. But, I mean, I was in Israel, for example, a few weeks after October 7th and went to the West Bank and Palestinian territories, East Jerusalem, talking to people about it. And it really is on one level, it's just a real-life melodrama of epic proportions, which even if you're just a storyteller or something, you could fashion a compelling narrative out of. So does it sell? Well, yeah, I mean, I think a level of pure excitement, it ought to be able to sell. And if it doesn't, I don't think that's because of some deficiency in the source material. I think it's a deficiency in the people who are trying to relay the material to a wider public.
You're on the ground after 10/7.
Yeah.
Did anything shock you out there?
I don't know that I was shocked, but one of the first observations that that I couldn't help but make was the ubiquity of pro-war imagery, the ubiquity of Israeli nationalistic imagery, which, having been a semi-sentient being after September 11th in the United States, I have, a 13 or 14-year-old memory of that being extremely prevalent, at least where I was in northern New Jersey, right outside Manhattan.
Yeah.
But this was even far beyond that in Israel. I mean, you could hardly look at even a building or a TV screen or a phone or a billboard or something without being inundated with these images of the hostages and just being lingered over and over and just instilled into people's heads, which, again, didn't shock me that that was the case. It's probably roughly what I would have expected, but to be in the environment where it's just so suffuse with this like galvanizing attempt to rally the entire population toward a common end is is something that you, I think, need to experience firsthand to really viscerally appreciate. And also, I mean, this happened to be my first time in Israel. I'd never been before, so goodest time as ever to go for the first time, right? And something that also struck me, especially in that climate, which is it's like in a pro-war, just collectivist sort of. I don't want to say mania because I don't want to be demeaning of it, but there's like a very extreme potency to like the collective societal sentiment, and I think it's also necessary to be there in person so you can experience how invigorating that is, and how it just forecloses the people who are immersed in it from really seeing contrary arguments to what they just kind of viscerally and collectively feel is the rightness of their current path. And that's a lesson or an insight that's translatable to a lot of different contexts, not just Israel.
Well, and this is sort of happening everywhere right now. I mean, Israel's, in spite of everything you said, which sounds quite right to me, it's tremendously divided, maybe more divided than ever. You look at Russia. It's important to achieve unity in that country. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. It has been for hundreds of years. Certainly, things were looking a little bit dicey a few months ago. Seems like with Putin winning his most recent election, the things kind of evened out a little bit. But China. I mean, Xi had to kind of kill off the opposition that was brewing in Shanghai during the whole COVID lockdown things. And then across the West, Macron's been clinging on to power in various weird ways for years. Rishi Sunak is probably going to be out of a job, and he was the guy who was supposed to last for more than a couple months. And then obviously what's going on here is a complete mess. It seems like every major digital power is, job number one is to just try to make sure that the domestic scene doesn't fall apart.
So you think that what the Israeli government's doing in terms of consolidating public opinion, domestic public opinion behind their war effort, is comparable to what like the Biden administration is doing in the U.S.? Like, sketch out what you see as the connection there a little bit more.
I would say that technology has had such a dramatic impact on people's state of mind, raising all of these who am I? Why should I bother doing anything? What's the purpose of life? Why should I get out of bed? Should I worship machines now? How do I respond to this? That all of, it's maybe five or six countries that are first ranked digital powers. It does present a kind of potential crisis of governing legitimacy. Well, why should I listen to you? Why should I pay taxes? Why should I sacrifice for anything? Why should I go to war? And because of the way that the internet does kind of categorize people out and create this taxonomy where everyone has a little subgroup that they can belong to and kind of disappear inside, that is a kind of has an acidic influence on good old-fashioned national unity as it would have been understood in the 20th century. And so as a government, how do you respond to that?
Right.
You got to figure something out, and I think a main reason why wokeness is so dominant right now is because the regime needed to kind of latch onto something that had some semblance of deep spiritual authority, and use that to say, this is what's going to justify this kind of new kind of sovereignty over people and machines alike. We're going to get our arms around everything because this is basically the state religion. The people are going to obey it, the machines are going to obey it, the machines are going to make the people obey it, and that's kind of what's going to tie everything together.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this fracturedness of, the collective consciousness that is a function of now the ubiquity of the internet, social media, it does raise the fairly alarming prospect that one of the chief tactics that governments will use to kind of rein in some of these, sentiments that they find they lack control of, is to galvanize the populace toward a common end, to that being war. I mean, that's probably what governments are most capable of doing. Not that the wars end in a way or achieve anything that is necessarily desirable, but in terms of lurching a populace into a war, governments have a very practiced ability to be able to do that consistently over the ages. So, I mean, you could imagine that although wokeness might have been a proxy like ideological force to achieve some of that conformity that maybe the internet had rendered a bit more untenable to maintain, I think the much more powerful force will ultimately be war. And the world seems to be heading ineluctably in that direction, which I find more disturbing than probably the average person in the media landscape, or at least I view the threat of it as more acute and warranting of more immediate remedial attention than a lot of others. Like I don't think the scope of it is, and the immediacy of it is really fully appreciated. But like one of the reasons why to be cognizant of it is that if you're wary of how governments can attempt to leverage public opinion, which otherwise they would not be able to maintain their pre-existing control of, one of the ways they could do it is to support a war effort. I mean, and Israel's a perfect example, and there are some kernels of truth to why it is. There's some kernels of truth that relate to like basic human nature that relate to why it is that governments can best utilize war as this galvanizing force. I mean, Chris Hedges famously wrote the book "War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning." Remember that in the early 2000s? That was back when it was more seen as a conventional left-wing position to just be against the concept of war just as a misery-making enterprise kind of by its own nature, which I tend to agree with. But now you see people supporting war for a variety of different ideological imperatives, including left liberal ones. Not that there aren't also some right-wing dimensions that are in there in the war brew now, but it's an extremely potent force. And just go to. I've been in Russia, and I see how even there, I don't think it's fully appreciated the extent to which war has this radicalizing effect on the populace. Not that everybody is like a dyed-in-the-wool, hyper-ideological zealot in favor of the war effort, but in terms of the influence-making kind of contingents of Russian society, at least that I was able to observe, there's this cosmological view of war that has developed that strikes me as irreconcilable with any kind of like rational understanding of how to resolve the war at this point, which is pretty disturbing. And you have similar zeal coming from other directions, from the U.S. and NATO, EU, China. Israel is a whole different story. I guess maybe I'm paranoid. Maybe somebody can like talk me down from the ledge or something, but I do feel like they seem to be on a precipice of a fairly perilous time for humankind, and I don't want to be like a buzzkill, but if that's the case, then there really needs to be concerted collective action to deal with it.
Well, the good news is that it's always a perilous time for humankind. So there's that. I don't know if I'm going to be the guy to talk you down. Look, there's a secret world war being waged in cyberspace every day, in our phones, in our heads, across the undersea cables. Like it's everywhere. And there is a race to achieve the most powerful AI, however you want to describe that, or if you even want to use those terms. There is a battle brewing for control of what could be a world computer. That's going to lead to war. I mean, it's already happening, and we see these things sort of spurting out in different places at different times, whether it's Armenia or Israel or the industrial assets in America that randomly explode sometimes, and we kind of don't want to talk about that very much because it's so disturbing. It's already on, and the question is, I don't think it can be avoided because it's already happening, but maybe we can tap the brakes. Maybe it's when it comes down to shot selection, we can avoid doing some particularly terrible things. And you just look at the war in Ukraine. I mean, this is, hundreds of thousands, many hundreds of thousands of men, Christian men in most cases, dead. And it's not
sometimes from the same familial tribe, as was explained to me when I was in Russia and was talking to people who had been regularly touring the front line and picking up on insights. And
the blame game is not the extent of the analysis here, but there is blame to be cast around, sometimes on specific people, sometimes on specific Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with Ukraine in particular, the Ukraine war in particular, the critical period was maybe the first 3 or 4 months of the war. I think if there was not a course correction very relatively early on, before like the momentum of each warring side had become so dug in and so fueled by like a combination of ideological zeal and just inertia that accompanies any really large-scale military enterprise, including the U.S., like Vietnam, for example, where all of a sudden you find yourself all gradually escalating to hundreds of thousands of troop deployments. If the trajectory toward kind of fatalistic confrontation was not averted within the first couple months, then at least my intuition was very similar to yours, that there's like almost nothing more to be done. So I've almost resigned myself to the inevitability of some kind of cataclysm, which, maybe is a dereliction of duty, just in terms of the duty of care that I and any human has to maintain like the continued existence of the species. But I don't know, I'm only one person. So I guess journalistically, going back to one of your first questions, the best contribution I can make personally is do what I can to accurately journalistically chronicle this pathway to destruction. Yeah. Not that I have any expectation that will contribute to its aversion or its being averted, but at least there could be a record somewhere.
Well, it's a proud tradition. You go back to the Peloponnesian War, and it was sort of like, this is a chronicle of a particularly gnarly war, and I'm going to write it in a way that is going to last for all time. That was the stated premise of the work. So I think you're on pretty firm ground there. I will say, though, I do think people have a propensity to race toward the precipice, and then they sort of get to the precipice, and it's like, whoa, I changed him. I don't want to die. I think that is a factor here too, and it's always easy to see how something apocalyptic could happen. It's not as easy to see how profoundly people can have that change of heart kind of at the last minute. So,
but when do you know? How do you know that you're at the precipice? Sometimes the precipice might not be perceptible. Yeah. I mean, just 2 days ago, there was another long-range drone strike on a Russian nuclear airbase deep inside territorial Russia, 400 miles away from Ukraine. There have been previously drone strikes on this same base in December of 2022. This, I believe, is the first significant strike since then, and it's barely even a news story in the United States at this point. I mean, just try to cast your mind back to 3 years ago. So I don't know, March of 2021, right? If I had told you that a U.S.-backed Ukrainian armed forces would be launching drone strikes outside Moscow on the strategic nuclear fleet of the Russian military, you would have thought that I was hallucinating some kind of Tom Clancy scenario, and you would have probably called, for me to get mental assistance with some caretaker, because that would seem crazy. Now, again, everybody's a nerd to it, so it's not even. I mean, did you even know that happened?
Now that's called.
You're
Tuesday.
a knowledgeable guy. You follow the news.
Yeah.
Did you even know that happened? I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, because you have to actually consciously look for it.
I did not know.
There you go. I mean, and it's insane. So, how do you know that you're at the precipice from which one must step back before diving into oblivion? I think, as people become gradually and more incrementally inured to some of these insane developments, then it's harder and harder to know where that precipice even lay.
Well, it is a good question, and it is, I think, true that in many of these countries, the people, or at least a good chunk of them, are actually considerably more aggressive and belligerent than the rulers. I think there are a lot of Chinese people who are like, Xi is kind of soft. And I think there are a lot of Russians who are like, Putin's just kind of getting old and just wants things to kind of, he doesn't want to rock the boat as much.
That's the case in the United States.
And it's the same in the United States.
Early on after the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, people maybe forget, or maybe they're strategically forgetting because it's no longer politically convenient to remember. Yeah. But the Republican congressional leadership and the Democratic congressional leadership were united in agitating for the Biden administration to take even more aggressive measures in support of Ukraine. Yeah. I mean, that was the chief criticism coming out of the House Republican leadership: McCarthy, Scalise, Stefanik, et cetera. And they were criticizing Biden for not being assertive enough in deploying long-range missile systems and so forth. It's a similar dynamic in the U.S., where the chief executive, as messianically invested as he is in Ukraine, still has had one of his political pressures coming from the legislature to go even further, and it's a bipartisan pressure, which is usually a pretty salient one, especially for a guy like Biden, who's still has like a 1990s triangulation mentality where like anything that Bill Clinton does that gets like half of Republicans and all the Democrats are like vice versa is like political brilliance. And so that's just, the calculus that Biden seems to be immersed in. But anyway, the point is that, yeah, you're right. This is a seemingly worldwide phenomenon where as over-the-top confrontational as some world leaders can appear to be, they're usually clamping down on people like within their periphery who are demanding even more hostility.
Yeah. So, there are a few different theories of the case of why the U.S. regime is so bent on maintaining this war and
Can
perhaps
I
even
ask
escalating
a vocabulary question? Sure. Regime.
Yeah.
So is your use or lack thereof of the term regime dependent on which party controls the White House? I mean, if Trump wins the election in November and he gets sworn in January of 2025, is the U.S. still a, quote, regime? Or is regime just like our normative ascription of like a certain ruling government if we want to cast a negative light?
It's like a political theory term of art. So, if Trump is elected and Congress, sort of nothing really changes in Congress and nothing really happens in the administrative state and nothing really happens in the deep state, it's just the same people, then the regime hasn't really changed. And I think we saw that when Trump was in office.
Does it make Trump part of the regime?
Well, he's like
he's presiding over
he's an unwelcome part of the regime. So governments rise and fall, but a regime, the sort of the deeply embedded structure of governance of a country can persist and survive even changes of party and so on.
So I think if Donald Trump can get nominated by one of the two major parties 3 consecutive times, then I think he can coexist within the so-called regime that I think he's positioned by some as somehow oppositional to in like a wish casting way. Because they don't want to think of Trump as part of the regime because that would make him compromise, right? But it's this convenient kind of political dichotomy to postulate that he's constantly in like warring conflict with the regime when I think there's actually a lot of compatibility there. Maybe some people don't want to recognize both people who dislike Trump because they have to catastrophize him and histrionically proclaim that he's this incredibly dangerous interloper who's destroying American democracy. I mean, for as long as Trump, I think, is breathing on earth, he will provide fodder for Democrats and liberals and whomever to claim that there's some imminent threat of democracy being overturned. But likewise, there are Trump supporters who want to feel good about their support of him because they think that it's somehow opposing the regime to, for the third time, nominate the Republican standard bearer. And I think both are kind of a bit distorted perceptions of reality.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, look, there's lots of stuff that Trump did or didn't do the first time around that did not really deliver on various promises that he made or did not really satisfy his base. I mean, where's the wall? There are things, right? And there are things that Trump did with regard to vaccines and some other stuff, Mnuchin, like these are not sort of anti-regime moves to make. And so in that respect, yeah, like there are some things. I'm the toughest on Russia. Like all these. There are compatibilities, and I think probably the Trump people and the regime people are reluctant to emphasize those.
One point that I'm almost sick and tired of repeating, but I have to continue repeating it like I'm compelled to, because not enough people are aware of it. Is that look? I'm probably the last person that you could accuse of having Trump derangement syndrome, right? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean. I was kind of made out to be, talking about like my journalistic philosophy, I was made out to be this anti-Trump, agitator or something, because I would notice that the national security state was concocting insane strategies to undermine Trump using lawfare, which continues to this day to some extent, and that to accept this was to accept the arrogation of power by these unelected security state entities of the ability to have massive influence on democratic processes.
Yeah.
So I'm 100%, I couldn't be more familiar with that line of argument, but I still nonetheless think it's necessary to remind people that if you actually go back and read the speech that Putin gave on February 24th, 2022, announcing the invasion of Ukraine, he runs through a whole litany of grievances with the American government. And he ticks off policy grievances like the abrogation of treaties, the arming of Ukraine, the deterioration in diplomatic relations, the obstinate refusal to consider Russia's so-called security concerns, the holding of military drills and so forth on the border of Russia and Ukraine. About half of what he condemned, policy-wise, that the U.S. perpetrated against Russia was done during the Trump administration.
Right.
Okay, so people have this like pop culture impression of Trump as being either a stooge of Putin and Russia, which is like the MSNBC version, or somehow, having this, I don't know, surreptitiously constructive relationship with Russia where he's actually going to diminish bilateral tensions or something. And neither is correct. Like, all I'm begging people for is just like a factually like, I don't even care about the ideology at this point or the wider political ramifications. Let's just deal with like a basic set of empirical facts about what the Trump administration did. And then we can talk about whether that's consistent with like a broad range of interpretations. But like the idea of him being a puppet of Russia or some kind of proponent of restoring relations with Russia is just not borne out by what he did when he actually wielded power for 4 years. And I think that's an important thing to really base one's assessment of a political candidacy on.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, this is just to bring us back to Ukraine for a little bit. I want to dot the I on this. There are these theories about how to account for America's behavior. Right? Is it because we're just sort of a young country and we're reckless and we think that we can go back to winning wars? Is it because it's just kind of a cash cow that we can like continue to just kind of cycle money through? Is it so that we can try out our new toys in the field? Like we've kind of gone through all these possible explanations. And then there's just this kind of lingering explanation of like, well, the real reason is something that they just aren't going to tell us. Because, I don't know, maybe it's the biolabs, maybe it's the money laundering, maybe it's the CIA trying to redirect natural gas into Europe or into NATO countries or, Hunter Biden, something, whatever it is privileged information that they're just not going to tell us no matter what it costs. No matter how unpopular this gets, they're just not going to come out and say, look, we're doing it because X, okay? So like, let us cook. What do you think's really going on?
Well, it also could be that there really is no one singular explanation. That, to me, is the more disturbing possibility.
The explanation that is no explanation.
Right. I mean, say we were in 1966, and you talk to, I don't know, the deputy secretary of whatever agency, say the Pentagon, like, what is the actual objective? What is the reason why America is doing what it's doing in Vietnam? You probably, if you ask like 40 different officials, you get 40 different answers.
I don't know. Wasn't that sort of like it's domino theory and it's anti-communism?
Kind of, but there's also like projection of national power, fending off the Soviet Union. There could be some motive that had to do with production of arms in terms of benefiting the defense industrial base in the United States. Very similar to what the explanations could potentially be for why the U.S. is doing what it's doing in Ukraine. Obviously, the nature of the intervention is different, but it's an intervention nonetheless, and it also has impinging upon it multiple different motivators and factors. I mean, I have talked to officials in the U.S. government at a somewhat senior level. I'm not saying I had like a coffee clatch with Antony Blinken or anything, but like enough to doubt that there is a cohesive single explanation for what it's doing because it's a combination of like institutional inertia. I mean, U.S. fixation on Ukraine in some ways dates back to the early 90s in terms of trying to pry it from the Russian or Soviet sphere of influence. You have arms manufacturers who develop relations with the arms manufacturers in Ukraine. So there's these commercial ties, there's diplomatic ties. I mean, Joe Biden himself, I think, definitely does have these messianic liberal interventionist views, particularly on issues around NATO and Europe and Russia. And I mean, I have found clips of Biden in the late 90s and early 2000s being the only senator who had like actually an active interest in bringing Ukraine into NATO at that point. Which was just not a mainstream position at the time.
No, but it's a way
so
of
you have
getting
that.
attention.
You have like Trump deferring to Mike Pompeo to run U.S. foreign policy for the preceding administration. There's just like a whole host of factors here that I think to distill it or to reduce it to one single explanation that's being like hidden or concealed is like an overly reductive take on how it is that U.S. foreign policy gets formulated, I think the reality of it is actually much more disconcerting.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's a good answer, but how do you sort of combat that? Like, how do you run against, I don't know, it's just kind of a mess. Does that really motivate people?
Well, I don't really care about motivating people. I'm happy to demotivate people. Like, I mean, I don't know. I don't feel like it's my job to rally the troops behind some kind of cause.
If you think the war is
I'd rather
bad,
just tell them what's happening, and then they can make of it what they make.
Yeah, all right, but just bear with me. You think the war's bad? Think the war should stop? Something else should happen instead? Moving people in that direction usually requires you to explain why it's happening. And if your explanation is, it's just kind of a sort of a hodgepodge of typical political and bureaucratic incompetence and self-dealing, is that enough?
Well, no, that's not it. I mean,
is that enough to move people to really bring some kind of peaceful settlement to this war?
Well, number one, it's not my job to bring forth a peaceful settlement to the war. I have no capability of doing that. So if in theory, I could proffer what I regard to be an accurate explanation for a factor that has given rise to the war, or that's motivating the perpetuation of the war, I'm not going to conceal that or decline to discuss that or report that because it might have the effect of not stimulating support for ending the war, bringing it to a resolution. Like, I don't make my be-all, end-all in terms of, for better or worse. I'm not saying this is how everybody on Earth has to live, but like my chief priority is like, is this true? And then whatever second-order effects are given rise to from that, then that's not even within my control. I can control whether I can properly convey the truthfulness of something or not.
But you are worried about it all slipping into a global conflagration.
Yeah, I am. But I don't think I can do anything about it.
So there's got to be some connective tissue somewhere, right? So you got sort of the journalists doing truth over here, and then sort of imbeciles doing bad stuff in government, and never the twain shall meet unless you've got some sort of healthy kind of public policy interplay with a kind of political rhetoric that isn't pure propaganda, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I do think there has been an impact on just trying to adhere or be faithful to like a steadfastly truthful depiction of what's going on. Because in the early stages of the Ukraine war, there was a bipartisan consensus behind the quote unquote aiding Ukraine. I mean, I immediately rejected that euphemism right off the bat because it gives the impression of like sending first aid kits or something into Zaporizhia when the aid, quote unquote, is like heavy artillery and missile systems and stuff.
Bullets.
Yeah. So I mean, I think aid does not really capture the nature of what's actually being provisioned. But yeah, I mean, sorry, I guess I lost my train of thought. Tell me what
we're live to tape, so
okay.
it's all gravy. Where did you lose yourself?
I don't know.
This is good, glorious, complete mind wipe.
It happens sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me just then.
I'll probably jump back into it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll toss this at you. There is like a propaganda problem, and the propaganda problem is exacerbated.
Oh, I got it.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so here's why I think the proof is in the pudding in terms of the efficacy of just being faithful to the truth in terms of describing what is animating this war effort. There was a bipartisan consensus in early 2022 around so-called aiding Ukraine, right? But that's gradually withered, where now there's probably Republican plurality opposition to, quote, aiding Ukraine. Now, some of that is partisan against the Biden administration because it's one of Biden's chief priorities of his entire tenure. And that's always the case in terms of how political opinions shake out. But I do think part of that probably has been influenced by just describing the ridiculous left liberal messianic zeal that informs the Democratic position on the Ukraine war. So always inflating the threat of Putin as Hitler 2.0, blitzkrieging, threatening to blitzkrieg throughout all of Europe, and resurrecting this framework of democracy versus autocracy, and that's like this overarching ideological prism through which to understand the need to ensure that Ukraine has enough artillery shells to beat back Russia in trench warfare by like a couple of 100 meters or something. Like, none of it actually adds up to a coherent case for the actual policy. But so I think pointing that out and just describing the absurdities of it probably has had some influence on Republican public opinion toward the war, such that it's not much more even, or it's much less lopsided in favor of continuing to arm Ukraine, which has an effect on how policymakers are responding to public sentiment and creating policy from there on. Now, I still think that Congress, for example, is likely to provide another round of funding to Ukraine within a couple of weeks. But it's a bit more of a difficult haul now that there has been some progress made in changing people's views on how to think about the war. And I think that stems from, at least to the extent that I've contributed, to trying to just present an accurate appraisal of some of the ridiculous notions that are popular that have fueled some of this war sentiment.
Do you feel like there's a bit of a backlash against propaganda, overt and covert? Is it getting easier to read true things on the internet?
I don't know. I'm of a mixed mind about it. Sometimes I think that, like, for example, if social media was in full swing in like 2002, 2003, that it would have been impossible for like the Bush administration and the Democrats who were supporting the war, like Schumer and Kerry and so forth. I think it would have been probably, I don't know about impossible, but much more difficult to sustain what was a self-evidently false narrative to anybody who had like the maximum amount of information. Whereas if you're just sitting and watching the nightly news, which more people were doing in 2000, 2003, I think you're much more susceptible to government manipulation, especially if the government's seeking to craft a narrative to undergird its launching a preemptive war. So I do think that there might be a bit more difficulty nowadays for government officials to sustain, like, systematized campaigns of deceit. But at the same time, I don't know, tell me what you think. I mean, I think there might be more opportunities to more subtly manipulate public opinion by like seeding different ideas within social media, like maybe allowing them to grow somewhat more organically, but the organic blossoming of those views, for whatever reason, empowers the state authorities. So I think the manipulation of public sentiment has to be a bit more subtle, but it might be just as salient as it was before. I don't know. I don't have a necessarily fully developed cogent thesis on it.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. I mean, I think, there's a kind of fatalism that's bred by the kind of information overload that a lot of people subject themselves to on the internet, because it's kind of the point of the thing is to like consume it until it becomes excessive. Where even if you do come across a kernel of truth with a capital T, you're like, what has it done for me lately? Like, can I actually, do I just have to content myself knowing that I encountered some truth today? Can I operationalize that knowledge in any way? Does it lead to any kind of different outcomes? And on the internet, it can seem like, well, no, like you just kind of have to like pat yourself on the back or, wistfully remember a time when there seemed to be more truth out there to partake of. And then just kind of continue on with the scroll. So it does seem like, the propaganda is less overt in some ways, even though in others it seems to be like even more, like there is a new flag and you're going to use that flag and you're going to respect that flag and it's going to appear everywhere. And some forms of propaganda, are becoming more overt, but it's kind of just settling into like the background noise of everyday life.
It's also more socially enforced. It's more like laterally enforced than top down. I think top down enforcement of propaganda strictures or trying to constrain very myopic narratives to, bolster a war effort or something, that's a much dicier proposition before. But again, perhaps even more insidious is kind of cross-cutting, socially enforced propaganda that either that the government officials or state officials or power factions may or may not have some direct involvement in, but it can be just as impactful, or it could be just as affecting of individuals who are within that ecosystem. So for example, if let's say you come upon a truthful observation or observation that you genuinely believe to be truthful, but you know that there will be social repercussions to publicly expressing it, then maybe that is much more of a disincentive for you than it would have been 20 years ago, when there was not this possibility that your coworkers or your second and third order social relations would take a negative view of something you said and try to impose some kind of consequence on you for it. So just to give one small example that is somewhat unique to me, as somebody who was very skeptical of, for example, the Trump-Russia narrative from the very early on, before most people were really even covering it, frankly, but not from a ardently partisan pro-Trump perspective. I'm somebody who spent a long time fending off accusations that I was somehow sinisterly aiding the Russian government, or I was compromised by Russia or something. And so there's a big irony now in that a lot of people who were largely in agreement with me on that sort of stuff, including earlier phases of the war in Ukraine, when I felt that the U.S. government was playing an exacerbating role in inflaming tensions and increasing the likelihood of war. Now I find myself veering significantly from people who had otherwise been in agreement with me previously on that range of issues, because there has been a transition to a bit more, and again, it's a partisan polarization effect, but on a geopolitical scale, where you do see that because people want to oppose the regime, to quote you, or because they want to, style themselves as oppositional toward whatever construct they view as the regime.
Dissidents.
Yeah. They now find themselves, or they now have come to basically just be pro-war partisans, but for the Russian state. And that was something that I was always accused of doing, and I was mindful of rejecting because it did not reflect my actual views. But now I do see this pretty insidious dynamic where people who have been more associated with my point of view on this are trending in that direction, which I'm just not, and I think is actually untenable and is contributing to barreling the world toward catastrophe. But I have a disincentive to be truthful about what I'm observing, because it's not going to be popular with my social media metrics, or
right.
I mean, people know. I know that people tell me directly, in other words, there's a social incentive for me not to be honest and forthright. Now, I try to correct that. I try not to be hostage to that, but lots of people have jobs and livelihoods where they can very reasonably prioritize not rocking the boat or not saying something that they believe to be true, because it could have these negative repercussions for them. You have to be in a fairly unique position, as I am, to even see any kind of self-interest in maintaining, fidelity to that honesty.
Yeah, there is this sort of weird, it's not just the risk of getting dogpiled and destroyed on the internet for saying something true. There's also the risk of just being ignored to death. Yeah, I mean,
whatever the incentive is that's being projected onto you, whether it's just lack of reach or lack of social approbation, or it doesn't matter. I mean, this new form of control of public belief, public sentiment, can have that effect on lots of people. You kind of have to wait for I don't know. I'm thinking back to the George Floyd uproar, where lots of aspects of that did not seem to me to be particularly well reasoned, and you'd go to these public, basically, displays of religious exaltation, where there are literally people doing what I had previously seen only at evangelical Christian worship ceremonies, where they're holding their hands out and they look like they've just been baptized and so forth. And I don't like to denigrate, belittle anyone.
But
because they obviously are very passionate and sincere about it. But somebody with the critical, perhaps jaundiced eye, I think ought to have been there, like observing and chronicling maybe some of the slight excesses of like what was being espoused there. And it was not popular to do. But I think became more popular over time when like just sentiment shifts. And when sentiment shifts, it's arbitrary. The point is like, you're having me think aloud here, but I almost wonder if it might be preferable now to go back to like 2003 when all you had to do was circumvent the government rather than circumvent these like millions of little aggregate pressures that sometimes are not even noticeable to you, but definitely have an effect on your psyche if you're just like a living, breathing human who's interacting with the world.
Totally. What do you think is the true thing that will get you in the most trouble on the internet for saying?
That I'm drop dead gorgeous. Oh no, that will just provoke
an admirable dodge.
That will just generate some pitying laughter.
Yeah, come on, I'm trying to get you in trouble on the internet.
I don't know. I think there's a lot of stuff that people like to pretend is more unutterable than it really is because they like to posture as being like the protectors or possessors of this like forbidden truth. Like a lot of people, frankly, who are online racial obsessives have that point of view, I find, where they'll say that like they're not allowed to, put their name to their public statements about how there are these, inborn racial differences between the groups. And I just will talk to them because like I will talk to anybody across the board, whatever wacky stuff they purport to believe. And I don't know, I just don't think that, I think that can be overestimated because there's something like self-validating about thinking that you're like you're the last man standing, like defending some, again, prohibited truism or something that you need to impart upon the public for their own benefit. I don't know, I mean, for a while, there was a huge taboo about criticizing Israel or criticizing the U.S. policy in Israel that I think has diminished somewhat just because it's been overwhelmed by like the enormity of what the U.S. has been subsidizing and operationally coordinating in Gaza for the past 5 months. I don't feel that there's much of a risk for me to say what I think is true about the U.S. being deeply implicated in, and the Biden administration in particular being deeply implicated in just like the wanton pulverization of basically defenseless populace. Not that I quote support Hamas. I mean, my first reaction on October 7th was I can't believe. I mean, whoever would have perpetrated such an attack on Israel had to know that it would immediately engender the most ferocious possible response that you could imagine, and they must not care because they have some messianic zeal in their ideological program for why it's worthy of a sacrifice on that scale.
And so
I don't think there's anything. I mean, I feel
really shifted on that one because now you've got sort of, mild criticism used to be like, well, come on, whose side are you on really? And now you've got huge crowds in front of the White House during State of the Union. Hamas is awesome. Like, come on, you guys, we can do this. Sort of like, how you started out with some guys who are critical of the Ukraine war, and then you fast forward a couple years, and they're like, okay, F it, I'm, just to Paris. Like, let's go Russia.
Yeah, the binary thinking to me is one of the great scourges of our age that leads to ridiculous overcorrections like the one that you just laid out there, where there are actually people who are pro-Hamas. Like, I mean, I'm somebody who would have been instinctively skeptical that being pro-Hamas was a real thing. It would normally strike me as a way to deliberately discredit people who are taking on rational criticisms of U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel. Oh, just say that they're pro-Hamas and they're like these, radical Islamists or something, or sympathizers with radical Islam, which I still do think is a point that's used to unduly malign a lot of people, but I have to acknowledge, because I'm into truth, that there is a segment of that pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel cohort which actually do view Hamas as acting justifiably to have,
Yeah.
attacked a kibbutz, really, in southern Israel. I feel like these people don't even know the first thing about who they're saying were legitimate targets for an ambush attack. I mean, especially the Israelis who were in the kibbutzim in the Negev, in the southern Israel, they tended to be much more left-wing and conciliatory with the Palestinians than people who live elsewhere in Israel. No, they were the ones who were the chief targets of this attack. So it just doesn't make sense on a host of levels. And it's similar with people who have, because they want to oppose the regime, gravitated to what I think is this unwarrantedly pro-war, pro-Russian position. And you have people digging in because they come to view this stuff. I think what's really destructive is when people tend to view conflicts like Ukraine, Russia, or Gaza, Israel through the prism of partisan culture war stuff, because that's just inherently a complete blight on your ability to reason.
It's just such a manipulated environment.
Yeah, it is.
From many different angles.
Yeah. So
I mean, just look at the sort of TikTok thing is just a sort of classic example. I mean, yeah, okay, TikTok's bad in some ways, and it's easy to understand all the ways in which TikTok is bad.
Well,
you're
the tech guy. What's your nutshell synopsis of the TikTok threat that we're told is so
yeah,
pressing?
I mean, look, it's easy to see all the ways that TikTok sort of hurts America and hurts Americans, and what all the downsides are, and how bad it is that China is just sort of continuing to hoover up all of our data. And they got the Grindr data set, and they got the sort of government data set, and it's all very bad. So what do? We can't ban TikTok because then they'll ban Facebook next or whatever. And it's like, well, that doesn't really make any sense. And all these big tech companies are basically part of the government anyway. So you get rid of it, you don't get rid of it, you sell it to an American company, you don't sell it to an American company. Whatever it is that happens with TikTok, that taking decisive action on that front is not the end of the story. It's probably barely the beginning of the story. We need digital rights legislation, maybe even an amendment to protect American citizens' access to and use of fundamental digital technologies that they need in order for their online life to be recognizably American. That's what we need.
And banning TikTok does nothing to address what a lot of people claim is the principal problem with TikTok, which is the addicting nature of this scrolling, algorithmically curated video service where you're served with stuff that is causing 12-year-olds to be locked into their phones for 18 hours, which I think anybody would agree is probably not ideal. But I mean, hasn't that most appealing feature of TikTok or the most addictive feature of TikTok been basically pilfered from it by the other platforms anyway?
Only American companies can brainworm
right.
American
I mean, so
children,
only Google and Meta are allowed to addict users for 16 hours a day, but because that data is not being, siphoned into the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party, then that's okay. I mean, when I look at these hysterics talk about the alleged threat of TikTok, including in Congress, where they just recently expedited passage of this TikTok prohibition bill faster than they've moved almost any legislation in recent memory. It was like a legislative sneak attack, really, because I think the longer that people would be able to scrutinize the provisions of the bill that was passed overwhelmingly by the House, the more opposition that would have materialized, because this bill does not just, quote, ban TikTok, or it's not even narrowly tailored to TikTok. It's creating a new unilateral power that it accords to the president.
Presidential power, yeah.
To determine on his own volition that a certain application, which is anything from website to a mobile app to basically any internet service, it seems to me, the definition is broad enough to encompass, can just say that either China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran, which are the designated foreign adversaries that are at issue in the legislation, they have undue control or influence over that application. Therefore, the president can just unilaterally prohibit it. I mean, that's really what Congress is now trying to empower the president to do. So TikTok or not, it's almost like not even the issue at this point, because the vehicle by which they're trying to ban TikTok is actually a massive power grab by the government, by the national security state.
You got to make sure that the cure is not worse than the disease. And right. I think, I don't think there's probably that much argument over whether America would be in a stronger strategic position if TikTok had not managed to penetrate American society in the way that it has. But that's just kind of step one in sorting this out.
I'm not
You
willing
look
to
at Silicon
concede
Valley, you look at the influence of Chinese money that's just everywhere, and how deeply the Chinese, they've got more ways than TikTok to wiggle their way into our soft underbelly.
I'm just not willing to concede the point so readily that TikTok is a uniquely pernicious force in American life, or that it poses unique harms to American youth. Because number one, I think there's like a mental bias just to think that as one grows older, that the kids have gone astray, or they're these nefarious forces that are hobbling their development or causing all kinds of social problems. Now, not that that can't be the case. Mm-hmm. I just think that it's worth like checking oneself to make sure that like you're not like reasoning in a biased way about it, or that you're not overly ascribing harm to features of like adolescent or younger person's life that they don't actually perceive themselves as being harmed by. Like I don't know. I think that there was like when I was an adolescent and I would hear adults pontificating that everything that I was doing that was wrong and that I shouldn't have the ability to like consume the content that I want or do what I want. Not that I was like brilliant or that there might not have been some limitations imposed on what I was able to do that would have been rational. I don't know, the officiousness or like the arrogance of the adult kind of hectoring. I remember like being legitimately annoyed by, like for good reason. So I don't know, I'm wary of something by dint of being hyper popular among the youth necessarily being bad. Because like, it seems like a lot of the ways in which TikTok is supposedly bad, it's been in the realm of conjecture. Like it'd probably be better if everybody who's using TikTok was like reading long form magazine articles or something, but that's just not the case. Yeah, your
my
book.
Personal book.
Yeah, they should be reading my Substack instead of using TikTok, but like I can't really
QED.
make that the case. So I don't know. I just do you think it's been established that it's that immediate and urgent and obvious of a threat? I don't know. I think it's overstated because people want to make the case that its connection to China, or its purported connection to China, was what really ought to compel immediate action to redress.
Well, I think the situation with China is quite bad. I think they've just basically owned us on a number of fronts, ranging from human on the ground in China to TikTok to infrastructure to all kinds of things.
But why should I be more concerned about China hypothetically, which they've never been demonstrated to do? I mean, the politicians who are pushing this could, at any time of their choosing, come out and provide some actual evidence of China manipulating the algorithm to destroy the minds of American youth or whatever the theory is. But they don't provide it.
Because we're in a secret war. We can't tell you what's going on because then we'll lose.
But why should I be more concerned about that than my own government arrogating to itself these extreme new censorship powers to control the speech that I'm allowed to consume or the speech that I'm allowed to express? That's the bigger issue for me.
Digital Rights Act. We should just do a show on only this. Just an hour on TikTok. There's a lot there.
There's a lot.
Yeah. All right. On that note, thank you. Keep going. We'll be watching.
Thank you. Did I make sense? Was I coherent?
Yeah, you did.
Fulfill basic
I gotta close
fluency?
I gotta close out the show though.
Okay, good.
Okay, so Michael, thank you so much. That's all the time we've got. Give us a like, subscribe, comment below. Let me know what you think about TikTok. Let me know who you want me to interview. Until next time around, I'm James Poulos. This is Zero Hour. May God have mercy on us all.